And Art, in which war did you serve?
During the Vietnam War.
And which branch of service were you in?
United States Air Force.
What was your highest rank?
Staff Sergeant, E5.
And in which general locations did you serve?
Basically, my home base was actually Tachikawa, Japan, and Naha, Okinawa, but most of our time was spent in country or in Thailand. And when I say in country, it's Vietnam.
Art, how did you get in the service? Did you enlist or were you drafted?
I enlisted. I knew it was just a matter of time that I was going to give greetings and salutations, and I didn't want to be a foot soldier. So I stopped at the Air Force recruiter and signed up down there. And it was funny because part of the story is that I wanted to get into heavy equipment, and when I took what they call their idiot test, I said, "Oh, you'll have no problem getting into that." And when I got into basic training, and after that, through when I was getting ready to go to tech school, they had to fill out this dream sheet in Lackland. And of course I put down heavy equipment first, and they had categories, and that was one of them. And I had put down 2 other items, and for this day, I can't remember what the second item was, but the third thing was a loadmaster. So this tech sergeant said, "Oh, you wanted to get into heavy equipment?" I says, "Yes." He says, "Well, that school's filled." So yeah, I couldn't get into that. And he said to me, I said, "But the guy in Hartford said," he says, "he lied to you." Just like that. It was pretty comical. Whatever the second thing was, I couldn't remember, and the third thing said loadmaster. He says, "Oh, you want to be a loadmaster?" And I figured it's something to do with loading, and so he says, "Are you afraid of heights?" And I says, "Yeah." And he says, "Do you like to fly?" I said, "No." He says, "You're going to do just fine." And that's basically, the rest of it is all history.
Oh my. Where were you living at the time you enlisted?
East Granby, Connecticut.
Do you recall the date? Or at least the year?
I went in July 15th, 1965.
Oh, early.
Yes.
Why did you choose the Air Force and not one of the other branches?
My dad was Army Air Corps, and I just thought at the time they offered, something that I thought would be pretty good. Again, not knowing that I wasn't going to get into the field I wanted to get into, but that was basically it. I think my father was probably one of the bigger influences on that, because he was World War II, and so that's probably why I stopped down there.
Where did you go for your basic training?
Lackland Air Force Base in Texas.
Can you tell me what that was like?
Just like anything you see in basic training, it was, just trying to get young guys acclimated into the military's way of living, discipline and physical fitness, which wasn't, I didn't, being 20 years old, 19, 20 years old, you don't really think about stuff like that, but it was pretty warm in Texas at that time, but it wasn't much of anything.
Now, was it in basic training that you found out you weren't going to get the heavy equipment?
Towards the tail end, that's because we had to get into, they put us into a tech school, and that's where I left. After I left Lackland, I ended up going down to Shepherd Air Force Base in Texas, and that's where I went through loadmaster school down there.
How long were you at Shepherd learning to be a loadmaster?
It was about 3 months.
So what was that training like?
It was basically learning weight and balance work, and how aircraft stay in the air. It's all due to weight and balance, and they didn't really get into a lot of other stuff like airdrop and stuff like that. It was basically just teaching us the fundamentals of weight and balance work on an aircraft, and how it works and why it works. So
you weren't even assigned to a specific aircraft
no,
yet?
Not yet. We did go up, they took us up in a 124 once, which was, when you first start flying, I said to myself, what am I doing, and, but you know, it's just the nature of the beast. And when you first start out, you know, you're a little apprehensive and a little scared, you know, because you're not really knowing what you're doing and stuff like that. So, but we finished that up, and the next thing I went to was I had to go through the altitude chamber, and once we got passed through that
Now,
was
what was the altitude chamber?
that was just taking us to acclimate us into showing us what it was like to go up to different heights, and what they do is they take you off oxygen and shows you what happens when you have a lack of oxygen. But it's a requirement that everybody that goes through flight status. And then we got our flight wings as aircrew members, and I came home. After that, I was home. I got home the day before Thanksgiving, 1965, which was, for me at the time, of course, never really having been away from home and stuff like that. It was nice being home for the holiday. What I didn't realize at the time was that if 30 days from there, I would be in Japan, because I already had my orders.
You did have your orders?
Once I left Perrin, I knew I was going to be going over to Tachikawa, Japan. What I didn't realize was that's going to place me in Tachikawa, Japan the night of December 23rd, 1965. The next morning I woke up, it was the day before Christmas. You talk about somebody that was homesick. I didn't realize, you know, I mean, I didn't even think about it at the time, but yeah, I woke up that next morning, and we were in a what they call transit barracks, because everything was kind of shut down in Japan because of holidays. So the rest was pretty comical. We hooked up with a sergeant over there that had been there before, and he took us down to Tokyo for our first experience in Japan, and we went to you know, typical spots GIs go to, and ended up going to a restaurant. And the only reason we picked the restaurant is because and out there they had all the food in windows, in a window display. And Mama-san came out, and we pointed to what we wanted, and that's what we ate. And the rest of the time we spent partying, and then we got back to Japan, or back to Tachikawa that night. And next morning I woke up and really homesick because it was Christmas morning. But after that it was all downhill, so it was pretty good.
So you actually arrived in Tachikawa on December 23rd?
Yes.
What was your first impression?
I was impressed with the country. You know, I guess I was impressed when I got into the city, and it was just a mass of people. I mean, you know, having come from here in Connecticut and not being around any real big cities, like, you know, I mean, I've been to New York and stuff like that, but I mean, to get into a city like that, and they use a lot of, and they still do, they use a lot of public transportation over there. And it just moves hordes of people, but I mean, it's just massive people. But, you know, first impressions, you know, I didn't really see an awful lot of it. And after that, we spent most of the time on the base, because now we were getting acclimated into our job that we were sent over there for. So I was assigned to the 7th Aerial Port Squadron. There was probably about 30 of us that went over together. Half of us went to the Aerial Port Squadron, the other half went to the 815th, which was a flying outfit, which we were actually assigned to for flying. But the Aerial
Now,
Port...
when they sent you to Tachikawa, that was going to be your home base? That's where you were going to stay for your duty?
That was basically my home base, yes.
So half of you, so actually you were with some of your friends.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
When you got assigned to the 7th Aerial.
Yeah.
So once you got assigned there, what did you do?
Well, first of all, we got processed onto the base and into the squadron and barracks and stuff like that. And then we were kind of set up with some of the senior NCOs that, you know, they were our teachers over there. We were doing airdrop, and we were rigging loads, and that's part of what we did. The other part was to get qualified on the 130s. The 815th was flying 130A models, And we went through basically flying with another loadmaster to get acclimated onto the aircraft, and we worked the actual weight and balance, and it's a learning process. And that was the first thing. It was to get what they call logistic qualified. That was just to fly regular cargo missions, to move cargo and troops from one area to another, and that's the first thing we got qualified
So in your
on.
training, where were you, when they were actually teaching you to be a loadmaster and you'd move cargo, where would it be, into Vietnam?
Oh yeah, we would. Our first trip was down to Cameron Bay. I spent I don't really recall how many weeks. So it was 2 or 3 weeks we were down there anyways. It might have even been a month, might have been 30 days. I was assigned to to a crew with another loadmaster, and basically he just let me do all the pre-planning of the loads and doing the weight and balance work on the aircraft, and he just oversaw everything that I did. And that was basically my first experience of getting into a combat zone. It was a Cameron back then. We lived in canvas Quonset huts. They didn't have when I left there, they had air-conditioned barracks, but when we first got there, the mess hall was, you ate out of a tray, and after chow, you went outside and you dunked it into the soapy water and into the clear rinse, and that lasted about 2 days, and I had the GI so bad after that, I ate nothing but sea rations for the next 3 weeks. And peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I wouldn't touch the chow hall. But
Once you flew cargo into Cameron Bay, why would you stay the 30 days?
we were assigned there for loadmaster or for duties flying in country to supply other bases and stuff like that.
So once you were in there, you would fly out?
We were going through, my first mission was it was a rude awakening into what was really going on over there. We went into a base called Tuiwa, which was north of Cameron. I believe it was north of Cameron. And we got in there, and we taxied off the runway and into the parking area, which was all PSP strips, and we were probably the second or third I think we were like the third or fourth aircraft ready to get unloaded. So, it went in stages, and they unload you, and we finally got unloaded, and now we're waiting to get reloaded to fly wherever we had to go, wherever they needed it. And they had a big offensive up in that area up in there. And like I said, this was my first experience in country. I mean, this is in probably, I want to say I was probably in February or March of '66. And planes in front of us get loaded, and now it's our turn, and they had what they called rough terrain forklifts, and they had pallets because we're all palletized. And my first load was a pallet load of 5 bags, and I had no clue what it was.
When did you find out?
They told me.
Wow. That was your
So
first.
they were body bags.
So, what kind
So
of cargo did
So anyways, we took those into Saigon, because that's where the big mortuary was down there, where they took care of things down there. But yeah, that was a hell of an awakening into the first mission down there. And then after that, it was just we'd pick up all kinds of different supplies, supplies for logistics, supplies, food. We'd move troops with our with cargo, and we just flew all over different bases in Vietnam. Wherever Cameron was a big spot, we'd go into Saigon, pick up loads there, and fly it to someplace else. It was just all in country, but we'd end up back at Cameron at the end of the day. So we would it was called duty loadmasters, and we would sometimes we would just stay at at Cameron, and we would just, get the loads ready to go, and then we would just make sure that the weight and balance, they were set up to go on the aircraft, because we'd fill out the weight and balance, we filled out one load sheet every day, or you filled out one load sheet for every mission, for the weight and balance. Back then, we were moving so much stuff back then that you filled out one load sheet in the morning, gave them a gross weight for takeoff, and off you went, basically, because they knew the loads were set up pretty good. So, that's all basically I ever did, so.
So what things would you haul?
We would haul food, ammunition, fuel bladders. We would haul those wherever they needed them. Equipment, trucks, not too many trucks, but smaller vehicles. Jeep size are a little bit bigger and stuff like that. Water wagons, I mean, you name it, we hauled it. We'd haul anything.
So as a loadmaster, what was your specific responsibility?
First responsibility was the weight and balance of the aircraft, to make sure it was loaded properly, because that's how I got off the ground and landed. And then the second thing was to make sure the loads were secure. Third thing, if we carried troops or civilians or wherever we carried, make sure that they were in place so that, for landing and takeoff. Troop seats came down, we hauled passengers also, so. But basically, and then in the case of an emergency, you were there to get everything out, or, to help everybody out if we were coming passengers.
Right, as loadmaster, you were responsible for both loading the aircraft and then unloading it?
Right.
You would supervise both of those operations?
Yep.
So had you been taught at Tachikawa, depending on what the cargo is,
Yeah,
how to load it and where to put it in the airplane?
Yes, that's basically, and when you went out, and I'll tell you, the 30 days at Cameron probably taught me everything I needed basically to know as far as logistics went. After I finished that tour at 30 days, I went back to Japan, and then they have, what they do is take an evaluation test. It's both written and also it's practical, where you are sent out with what they call a standard eval NCO, and he was to evaluate your performance on that aircraft, and he could pass you or flunk you, either or. And that's how we got to fly. Then once you got qualified, then you were able to fly by yourself. You didn't have to have an instructor with you.
So you qualified on the 130?
Got qualified. I was the first one out of our outfit to get qualified. I was very proud of that, So I got qualified, and again, I don't remember the exact date I got qualified and stuff like that, but it was pretty early on. And then more missions, more TDY missions. We would fly from Japan into Yokosuka, I believe it was, to take on fuel. Then we would go to Taipei, and we would RON over in Taipei, and then we would fly in country the next day. We would leave our load, whatever we brought down into Vietnam. That's where most of it was at Cameron. We'd fly into Cameron and drop off whatever we had, and then we would rig for air evac, and we would air evac from, not so much from there over to Clark, but we would get set up from there to Clark for air evac, and then once we got to Clark, we would RON, stay overnight. The next day we would fly air evac back from Clark Air Base back to Tachikawa, because Tachikawa had the biggest military hospital over there at that time. Clark was, when guys got wounded over in Vietnam, they would do whatever they could do for them there. Then they would fly them to Clark, and then from Clark they would, kind of refine whatever they had to do, and then from Clark, then they would fly them back up to Tachikawa. And from Tachikawa, it depended on what their severity of their injuries were, where they'd end up going.
So you flew wounded?
Oh yeah, that was one of our big primary missions. When we left Japan, we went in country, and then we would rig for air evac to come back. And sometimes we'd air evac from Cameron, or we might go down to Thompson to fly out of there and then back to Clark. But most of the time, a lot of times we flew empty from there back to Clark, but in the mean, it wasn't that long of a flight, a couple hours. And then we would set the aircraft up. We'd have to put up all the stanchions for the litters and stuff like that down, on the aircraft. And then we would spend, our crew rest in there and at Clark, and then that day, whatever time we had to leave, they load us up with 30, 40 litters, and then we'd fly them back. Flight nurses would be on board and stuff like that. We'd fly them back to Tachikawa and unload. And then we go into crew rest for a day or two, and then boom, right back out again.
That was my next question. So when you're at your home base at Tachikawa, so you're only there a couple days and then you're flying out somewhere else?
Pretty much. Whenever they needed that was part of it. We did a lot of training in Japan. We did a lot of airdrop in Japan. We had 2 drop zones there. One was called the Mito drop zone, and the other was the Patton drop zone. Again, being an aerial port squadron, we did a lot of the rigging for airdrop. We did joint ventures with the Army and also in training, and also the Japanese military. So it was a combination of things. And then, you might do that, you might be back in Japan for only, 3 or 4 days, and then you would go back out again on the trip back in country. And there's other times you would cut back into Japan and you would probably stay at the 7th Area Port doing rigging and working airdrop or going to the drop zone. You might be there for 2 or 3 weeks, and then next thing you know, you're back out on the trip again. But we were allowed to fly 125 hours in a month and not to exceed 300 hours in a quarter. And they pretty much kept us up to that much flying if they had to.
Can you describe what a typical day would be like? Of course, depending on where you were. Say you were in Cam Ranh Bay and you were going to be there for 30 days. So just what would it, get up at what time?
Various missions. I mean, sometimes you fly at night, sometimes you fly during the day. Most of the missions that I flew, thinking back about that time at Cam Ranh, it was probably mostly day missions. You'd be up at, take off. Your first trip would probably be between 7 and 8 in the morning, say, and depending on where you would go, you would fly into one base, get offloaded, and either pick up a load, whatever they had to bring back, or you would go empty and fly back to Cam Ranh or go back to Tansanut or go into Da Nang. I mean, we flew into so many bases over there, anything that had a runway. Later on, we got into some of the really smaller strips. Well, anyways, go back to your question. That's the way the day would be. You would do that. Your crew day was 16 hours. That's the time you got up to the time you could stop flying. Not to say that we flew that many hours or we were out there that long, but it could go that long. There were times where sometimes the aircraft would break down and your crew day would really get extended because you couldn't go anywhere until you got it fixed. So legally, what they did is they let you, they said that you could still fly up to 16 hours in your day. If it went beyond that, then you'd have to go into crew rest and grab the next airplane going out. But that was basically it. You just, it was like a trucker today. He just makes stops. Well, we did it in an airplane. That was the difference.
Now, I know we talked before off camera about some of the rigging you did, and you were telling me about the plaid and the lapes. Can you tell me about some of those different kinds of things that you had to know?
Yeah, being part of the Aerial Port Squadron, we did most of the airdrop rigging when we'd had to do airdrop, and there were various types of airdrop. There was heavy equipment. There was a LAPES, which was a low altitude parachute deployment. And then there was a plaid, which was a parachute airdrop type of airdrop. And then what happened was they developed a new type of airdrop called CDS, Container Delivery System. And TAC came over and they would teach us from the States when they developed this. And we would go TDY someplace, which was, this happened to be down in Mactan Air Base in the Philippines. And we would teach the PACAF crews the procedure. We would do the rigging. We would then, one day we would actually get on the aircraft and we would make, get the load on there. And we would set up the strapping and everything for the deployment system. And we would teach the crews how to do that. And then we would actually fly the mission, do the airdrop, and then we come back in. Guys on the ground, which we were part of also, would recover the loads. We go back and bring them back to the hangar, re-rig the same loads again, and then the next day, somebody else might go up with the crew. We would work the drop zone, but we would teach crews different types of procedures and stuff like that. Most of this, the Lapes and Flats, they were used a lot in country because there was a lot of times that aircraft couldn't land. For various reasons, and basically the main one was because of hostile fire. So they would either do the Lapes or Plaid drop, depending on what kind of equipment they had to bring in or what they were bringing in. And CDS, I can honestly say that I never did one of those in country, but I know that today they still do that deployment system. It's still the C-17s and the C-5s, they still do that deployment system to this day.
Can you describe the laps and the plaid and tell what the difference is?
The Lapes drop was it was a skid platform. It could probably, again, I'm trying to remember back how heavy the loads could be. They could be pretty low, pretty heavy. But anyways, normally what it was a skid, approximately 8 to 10 feet long, and you would have your load on it. It could have a vehicle on it. We dropped vehicles on it like that. And what you would do is the aircraft, you would open a ramp, open a ramp and door, coming into a drop zone. And this is where the aircraft is not going to touch the ground, basically, hopefully, and it was not going to stop. It was going to take off after it dropped us. You would come into a drop zone and you would descend in there, and then you would roll out, and then the extraction chute would go out into the slipstream, and it had what they call a reefer cord around the chute to hold it tight. And once you got into that drop zone where you wanted to drop it, where you could let that load come out, there was an electrical charge that was fired because it had a wire in it that would actually open that reefer cord up and open a chute up, and that would force the load to get pulled out, and it would come down, and at that point, once the load left the aircraft would just take off again, and the platform would just skid on the ground. That was called a Lapes drop.
How close to the ground would the aircraft be?
Anywhere, well, I've seen some of them touch the ground. They had landing gear down, of course. But they would, but normally they'd be anywhere from, I'll say, the ideal thing was, 5 to 10 feet off the ground, basically not any higher than that, because if it was higher than that, you'd jeopardize the load from getting cracked up. So I'd say most of the time it was from the ground, about 5, 6, 7, 8 feet.
Now, who had the responsibility of timing it and letting the
pilot,
load go?
pilot and the navigator would get you in there. The pilot was basically the guy in control, and they also
letting the load.
they had the control of firing that reefer cord. So once they did that, then the load would go out. Our job was to make sure it left the airplane. That was part of the airdrop thing. That it was probably the most critical thing, is that if for something malfunctioned, like the reefer cord never went off, of course now you've got this load or this parachute out in the slipstream, and the load's not going to go out. So there was procedures in place that if you had a malfunction, there was ways to take care of it, and basically it was to secure the load. Because the one thing you never did is you never went behind it, because if something ever happened and it was a delay or something like that, and then the thing went off. You know, it was, you know, I mean, you know, I like to say we were trained professionals. You know, we were good at our job. We knew our jobs very well, and you know, and the one thing about an aircraft, you can't make too many mistakes with them because it's a very it's very unforgiving.
How was the plaid rigging different?
The plaid rigging was a little bit different, where it was basically an extraction, same thing, an extraction system, where the load would go out, and we would probably be about, I think the altitude was like 600 feet off the ground, and the same thing, it would go out in the slipstream, and then when it was going to be dropped, it was just kind of, it was just like the chute opened up, and then it would just be a gradual fall to the ground. But I mean, there wasn't much altitude. I mean, that was a little bit different. But the Lapes was a little bit scarier, because, not scarier, but it was a little more critical because of the fact that you were so close to the ground and stuff like that. And the CDS, that container system, it was multiple loads that went out at one time. It actually had almost like a netting, if you can visualize a net holding the load behind it to not let it go out. And the same thing, there's an extraction chute that's hung up on a pedestal, and when you release that extraction chute, it goes out in the slipstream, and it had a set of knives that would actually cut this webbing, and that's how the load would go out. And then it would just, the chutes, you know, had linear cords, and they would pull the chutes off or pull them open, and then they would free fall into the ground also. But there was anywhere, I'm trying to think, anywhere from 6 to 12 pallets that would go out at one time. And they had what was called honeycomb underneath them, so that it was made to soften the load, and, you know, it would collapse as it hit the ground. But depending on the size of the load, and I think, I'm trying to remember, the load was restricted to so much weight on those honeycomb things. That was the difference.
Well, Art, think back to some of your specific missions and some of your more memorable missions. I know we talked about a couple before, and kind of describe to me.
Well, again, I think the first one was probably the most eye-wrenching and eye-opening experience as to, you know, what was going on over there. You know, you just, you bring, when you see something like that for the first time, I mean, God, I could have thought of a million other loads that would have handled a lot better than that first one. But, you know, it's kind of an eye-opening experience. A lot of it was fun. There were certain things that certain bases or certain troops needed and stuff like that they really wanted, and it was nice to bring supplies into them and see what it was. But I think the best thing was one of the big things was the air evac missions. Those are probably the most memorable ones, because one, you got to see, you know, guys are really getting hurt over there. And you know, to get them back and stuff like that, those are good missions. Those are good times to get those guys back, because a lot of them were going home. Unfortunately, some of them, they'd patch up and they would probably go back, but you know, our job was to get them from point A to point B, and that was probably one of the most rewarding things.
Now, did you tell me that you had missions in Laos?
We flew a mission that was called Lamplighter, and then it was renamed Blind Bat.
Lamplighter and Blind Bat are the same mission?
They're pretty much the same. They started off in Da Nang, and it was a flare mission to kind of look for troop movements, convoys. The first ones out of Da Nang, a lot of them were in country, but once we got into flying the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the mission ended up in Yuban, Thailand. And what that entailed was that we were assigned there for 90 days, and we would fly, well, first of all, it was back before they made it known that we were flying out of Thailand. That was the first thing. So, but once we got in there, we would fly what they called an early mission and a late mission, and then we'd have a day of crew rest. The early mission would take off at sunset and fly till around midnight, and then the late mission would take off around midnight and fly to dawn. And we would be designated into different areas, either in southern part of Laos, the northern part of Laos, or even the southern part of North Vietnam. This is back in 65, 66, and 67. And what our job was to, we'd be flying blacked out, no any collision lights on, because you couldn't have the lights on because, you know, it'd be a prime target up there. We would be looking for either troop movement, convoys going up and down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, storage areas that they might have, and what we would have is that we would have fighters that would be fragged in, what they call fragged into us. They'd be flying support for us above us. And when we found, say that we found a truck convoy moving, of course the first thing they would do is they'd shut their lights off, and our job was to illuminate the area. The flare mission, on the 130 we had a chute set up in the back. We could carry, I think, 12 flares in the back on that chute. We would carry 250 flares on the aircraft. And depending on how much of an area we wanted to light up, we'd have 3 loadmasters normally in the back, sometimes 4. And one guy would be what they call the kicker. He'd be sitting up on top of the door. The other guys would be the loaders. They'd load the chutes. And we would go over the suspected area. The navigator or the pilot would say drop, and then we would drop 1, drop 2, drop 3, drop 4, as many as they wanted. They had a lanyard on the flare, and once it cleared the aircraft, and had a parachute on it also, parachute would come open, and the flare would light up. Each flare had 3 million candle power, or all magnesium. And when you put out a string of 6 or 10 or 12 flares, I mean, you could read a newspaper on the ground. That's how bright it was. And of course that would illuminate the area down below, and hopefully that would bring the fighters in, and we would turn down, we would turn away, and then the fighters would come in behind us, and then they would drop their ordnance on whatever was down there. Could be truck movements and stuff like that. And you could pretty much tell if you hit anything. Normally it would light up pretty good.
When you flew these flare missions out of Yukon, how many C-130s would take off together?
Normally there was 2, I'm trying to remember, 1 or 2 in each area at least. Normally it was 2 in an area that were assigned, or 1 in each area, 1 in the north, 1 in the south. Or sometimes it would be 2. And everybody would be assigned an area, because again, everyone was flying blacked out, and you've got all these aircraft flying around up there. I can remember one night there was, it was off in the distance, but I mean, it was how close some of these aircraft actually came to one another. And it's amazing that they didn't have more mid-air collisions and stuff like that. But it was pretty much coordinated. I mean, nobody ever wanted to see anything like that. So it was. And we did that from 1965 all the way up to 1971 when they suspended the missions. And I had, there is one of the guys that flew the missions, the Sam McGowan, he wrote an article about blind bat. And one of the stories he tells is that when I was over there flying these missions, there was another crew, this Major Frank's aircraft took a hit from anti-aircraft fire off the ground, and it hit their wing on the right side of between number between the fuselage and number 3 engine, and they really thought they were going to lose the aircraft at that time. So they jettisoned the load. They opened the ramp and door. They got rid of the chute. All these flares were in boxes, big wooden cases and stuff like boxes and stuff like that. They were loaded, and like I said, each aircraft took off with 250 flares on it. So, and each one of those flares weighed like 40 pounds. So they jettisoned the load. They got rid of the load, and they couldn't get the fire out. Well, Major Franks finally slipped the aircraft in such a way that he actually blew the fire out of the wing. It went out, but they were ready to bail out. But the problem was that they had lost all their hydraulics. I mean, they were really in tough shape. Well, anyways, he ended up going back into a base in Thailand, a northern part of Thailand called Nakhon Phanom. He landed there, but he did a heck of a job by bringing the aircraft back. But the whole crew did their job. I mean, the loadmasters did what they did. Navigator got him back. The pilot and co-pilot got the aircraft on the ground and got it flying back in there. And we went up the next day to pick these guys up, and we saw the aircraft, and I'm almost 6 feet tall. I could lay down in this wing, hole in a wing. That's how big it was, and turn around in it. I mean, that's how big it was. So, but things like that happened, and the unfortunate thing between after I had left, we did lose 2 crews over there, and there was 10 guys in each crew. So they got.
Was it in the Laos or?
In Laos, right? They got shot down. And once the SAM started coming in, then they started suspending that type of mission because, we were only flying 5,000 feet above terrain, 3 to 5,000 feet above terrain, and even though we were blacked out, you could still hear the aircraft, and we had anti-aircraft fire, not every night, but most of the nights that were out there, you could see somewhere off in the distance somebody shooting shooting up at you and stuff like that.
You were in combat. You knew you were being shot at.
Yeah. Well, but it's the funny thing, and I'm sure that anybody that's flown or been in a situation like that, nothing's going to happen to me. Really, that's the mindset you have when you do this. I never once ever thought anything was ever going to happen to me or the crew I was with. I just said we're going to do our job and we're going to come home. So.
Did anything ever happen to you or any of your crew members?
No, none of that. I did lose one crew member, but it was a non-combative accident. But no, we took one time we took a hit in a wheel well and stuff like that, but fortunately didn't hit anything, and we were fine. But and that was part of the job. If we weren't actually working, loading the flares and stuff like that, if we had extra guys, you'd watch for that, and you would holler out. You'd let the pilot know, and 9 out of 10 they would see it coming up, because they always had a spotter. That's what their job was, just look for the convoys and stuff like that. But when they saw ground fire, they turn right or bank right or whatever, or just to get out of the way, So, but no, we were very fortunate. We said that we used to our classification as a loadmaster was when you started off you were 3 level, then you moved up to a 5 level as you got higher up, and then 7 level and 9 level. We used to classify the gunners at the same thing on the ground. Either they're 3 level, 5 level, 7 level, or 9 levels, depending on how close they came to the aircraft.
How long were you in Thailand flying these blind bat missions?
66 and 67, basically, almost.
You stayed there that long?
No, we would go for 90 days. I'd come back, take a check ride, and then I would go back over again. I would if I had to get a check ride or something like that, I'd go back to the base, back to my home base. I'd stay there a couple of weeks, and then
Your home base at Tachikawa?
And then I missed something in between there. In January of '67, they moved us down to Naha, Okinawa. It was called a PCA move. Same outfit, but it was just moving down into Naha. But they either place, either Japan or Tachikawa. We would go back and I enjoyed the duty in Thailand. I really did. I mean, we flew like I said, an early mission and a late mission, off a day. We fly 10 missions in 15 days, and then we were given a 7 to 10 day break. And they didn't care where we went, as long as we were back to fly our next mission. So we got to travel to different places. I was fortunate. I jumped on a plane and went down to Australia. I went to New Zealand, and as long as I was worried about getting back, but I got back and stuff like that. But that was the orders we had, because they didn't let it. The orders we had didn't specify the fact that we were flying out of Thailand. So they were just like blanket orders that we could jump on any kind of aircraft. I mean, I flew Learjets from Yubon getting into Saigon just to try to get a ride back to Japan. And but I enjoyed the duty. I mean, we flew the mission, and when we were off, we were off.
Well, all right, so you got to Tachikawa in 1965?
Yes.
And when did you leave Vietnam to come home?
I left in August of '67.
So would you say that most of that time you were out of Thailand, or half and half?
I would probably say it was probably a little bit more time in Thailand than I was.
Now, why did you stay for more than a year? What was your tour?
Air Force, because the tour in Japan was 2 years. It wasn't 1 year. Vietnam was 1 year, basically, if you were outside of Vietnam. And the big thing is the Air Force was never, the Army was in charge of what went on in Vietnam. The Air Force didn't want any part of that, so they never really wanted to be there on a permanent basis. They were always what they called TDY. So that's why, that's what I heard anyways. That was politics though.
Well, when you were at Yubon, all your missions were night missions?
Yes.
The complete opposite of what you had been doing. How'd you like flying night versus day?
You get used to it. It's tough sleeping, but after a mission, you'd probably go down to the NCO club and have a couple of beers, and then went to sleep. In the morning, yeah, 8 o'clock in the morning.
How many missions did you fly, do you know?
Had 103 missions total.
Wow. Any catastrophic problems on any of them that you can recall?
Not on our watch. We were
103 missions, no problem.
Yeah. We had aircraft that would break down and stuff like that. We'd have to come back in sometimes. But other than that, at one incident, taking a hit in the wheel well, we had no problems. And that was with, and like I said, we flew a crew system at that time, so you flew with the same crew the whole time. So, it was different crews and stuff like that, but you knew most of the guys anyways. So
if you flew with the same guys your entire tour, you must become pretty close.
We are. We're still close. Today, as a matter of fact, 2 weeks ago, I was out in Las Vegas and we had a reunion. We have a blind bat reunion. That was our, trying to think, 5th or 6th reunion that we've had. And we've had some down in Biloxi, Mississippi. We've been out to Las Vegas here. We were down in Florida. And I still stay in touch with some of the guys that I flew with, and some of us, there's a half a dozen of us that are real close that we really stay in touch. And it's nice because, in 95 was the first one, and I remember going to that reunion, and there was probably about 7 or 8 of us that had gone overseas together, that were stationed in Japan and Okinawa together. And we got together that first day, and that night we decided, there was nothing really going on, so we decided we were going to go out to dinner collectively. And the 7 of us got together, or 8 of us got together that night, and we went out to dinner, and it had been 35 years since we had been together, and it was like one night had never passed, like a night had never passed.
You hadn't seen each other in
No,
35 years?
35 years. And it's like there wasn't a day that's gone by that we hadn't been together. That's how it seemed. So it was really amazing, you know. It was,
So when you left Vietnam, you didn't stay in touch initially with each other?
some of the guys I did. A good friend of mine, Ray Cooper, him and I, we roomed together in Japan. We went to Okinawa together. When we came back to the States, we wanted to stay on 130s. We were flying out of McGuire, out of New Jersey. And he and I, we roomed together again. We flew out of McGuire. And then in 1968, they took the 130s out of Mac, which we were assigned to, and put them in TAC. And he ended up going to Dyess, Texas. I went to Langley. And that was when we started kind of going in different directions. So we had been apart for that many years, you know.
And then in 1995, somebody decided to have the reunion? That was your...
They started it, one of the guys that was down he flew to mission. As a matter of fact, he was one of the first guys to fly one of the blind missions. Ralph, and I don't want to say Ralph's name, Crouch, I believe his last name was. I don't want to mispronounce it, but he was out in Biloxi. He retired from the Air Force. And he was down by Keesler, and he set the first one up, and it was great. It was really, really super getting together. And we had the next one down there also. And then what happened was the hurricane came through and blew everything away down there. I mean, literally, the hotel we used to stay in was actually wiped right off the pad there, and then we started going to different places and stuff like for a reunion. But we basically get together every 2 years. So, and it's like a college reunion. You know, it's the same thing. It just, you know, you look at everybody else and say, boy, they got old. You know, except for yourself. You know, but you kind of look in the mirror once in a while. You know.
Were you awarded any medals or citations? I know you were.
Yeah, you know, I never really much paid attention to other than the air medals. You know, I've got the air medals for flying all those missions. You got one air medal, or you got an air medal for 10 missions over North Vietnam, and then the rest of them were 25 missions was one air medal. So we ended up, I got nine, the air medal with 9 clusters on it. So.
And well, and I know there's a lot of others which will attach to this record.
You know, the ribbons were ribbons. You know, it's just either being in the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the wrong time. And I'm very honest with you. Other than the air medal, I never really paid much attention to them.
I'm going to ask you a couple questions about daily life, and depending on where you were, it was probably drastically different. How did you stay in touch with your family when you were overseas?
Well, it's funny. We get out to the high schools and we talk about our military experience. Some of the classes, especially around Veterans Day and Memorial Day. And of course, in today's technology, everything's on, you know, touch-tone phone, iPads, whatever. All letter writing. That's how we did it. I think in the 2 years that I was overseas, I think I called home once. And that was it.
Were you a good letter writer?
My mother was. I don't think there was a day that went by that I didn't get a letter from her. And a lot of them, unfortunately, it took, you know, sometimes, especially when we got to Thailand, to catch up with us, because our mail was sent to, you know, our home base, and same thing in Japan. You know, it was sent there, and by the time we got it, you know, it would be 2-3 weeks later, you know, sometimes. But no, I got to write pretty good, and I think the best letter I got was from my father. Never wrote. That meant a lot.
Wow.
But they did.
Did you save any letters?
No. I tell young people that I meet today going into the military to save everything, because you don't realize how important it is later on in life. You know, but I mean, let's face it, 365 letters. That's a big shoebox, you know, so,
Wow. What was the food like? Well, depending on what we found out what.
okay, well, yeah, in Vietnam, I really didn't care that much about it. But we did, after, I guess what happens is after you get out into the, it's like going into a job, you know, once you get used to going into different places and stuff like that. And back in 65, 66, 67, we could actually go into some of the cities, even in Vietnam, I mean, and Saigon. You know, we could travel, you know, we can go off base, you know, we were in civilian clothes, we can go into the restaurants and stuff like that, which we did. And you ate, you know, and the same thing with any of the other bases we went to. If you could get off base, a lot of times you went off base. If not, you ate at the chow hall. This is like anything else. You get used to the food, you know. I didn't eat vegetables until I went in the military. And for some reason, I don't know, I wasn't a big vegetable eater, but once I got in there, I couldn't get enough of them. But, you know, off base wasn't bad. On base, the food was pretty good, but a lot of your big bases had a BX where you can go out and get food also, you know, do the same thing.
What about in Thailand, Yuvan? Did they have, was it a regular American base? Did you have a chow hall and a BX?
Yeah, it did. We had that. BX, not really. They had a commissary that wasn't very big. You could go off base in Yuban. They had Thai food there. I like Japanese food. I wasn't too big on Thai food. Still not too big on Thai food. But Japanese food, Chinese food, I like that. I enjoyed all that stuff. And you did, you know, you got to see different cultures. You got to meet, you know, we got to meet different people. When I was in Japan, when we weren't flying, we used to go to a town called Shinjuku, which was just outside of Tokyo. And that was, it was like a college town. And these college kids, they get you into these coffee houses or into these, I don't want to say like it's like a karaoke bar. And they'd buy you drinks all night because they wanted to practice their English on you. You know, back in 65, you know, today, a lot of the countries, they're very versed in the English language, more so than they were back then. So these young guys, which were our age back then, kids, all they wanted to do is they wanted to practice their English on you. So they would, you know, they'd sit there and they'd buy you drinks all night to keep you there just to talk with you, you know. So it was a lot of fun, you know, in the off time.
Did you always have enough supplies of everything you needed?
I would probably say yes.
No shortages of anything ever?
I never, you know, I think that's one of the parts about being in the Air Force versus being maybe in Army or Marines. We didn't do without. I mean, they used to really razz us because, you know, we had air-conditioned barracks. They'd be intense, you know, and it was, you know, especially being, and not all Air Force, but being on flying status gave us a little bit of something extra, I think. And that's why you know, I'm kind of glad that I ended up getting into the field I got into, and you know, we did get some of the perks that a lot of other guys didn't get.
Were there any shortages of supplies you needed to load your aircraft when you had to actually go on mission?
No, not necessarily. Most of the places that that we would go into were set up to either load or unload us. Going back into in-country and stuff like that, we did do some missions where we would go into real short strips, dirt strips and stuff like that, where we would, again, not being able to stay on the ground, we would land. We would have they had arms on the ramp that held it up. We would disconnect the arms before we landed. We would actually turn off the runway, the active dirt runway, onto a taxiway. We would have that ramp drop. We would pull the emergency handle, let the pallets roll right out the back, pull the ramp up, and come right back around and be in the air within 5 minutes of landing and taking off. Those places there didn't have anything, but they didn't need anything, and all they wanted is what we could supply them. I did half a dozen missions like that, which was really different.
Now, you had air-conditioned barracks probably at Tachikawa. Did you have air-conditioned barracks at Yubon?
No, we stayed in, the officers did. The enlisted guys, we didn't. But we had what they called hutches. And what they were is they were open air hutches. They were all screened in. And they'd have a metal roof, and about halfway down I'd have some more metal just to deflect if we got any rain and stuff like that. But in Thailand, I think the average temperature down there is probably, during the day is probably 80. At night it probably got down into the 70s, and that was about it. You know, the rest of the time was pretty warm there, so it wasn't too bad.
How did you handle the stress of your job?
You know, looking back at it, I think at the beginning, because I was more nervous having a new job and having the responsibility that I had, probably weighed on me a little bit. But after I got to the confidence built in myself, I never really had the stress factor. I never thought I had stress on me.
Even when you were flying those blind bat missions?
You know, it was a job. I never thought anything bad was going to happen. It was a job that it's like you getting in your car in the morning and going to work. That was my job. I got on the airplane, I went to work.
Wow. Did you do anything special for good luck?
I don't think I did it for good luck. I think what I did is, unfortunately, I had the bad habit of smoking back then, and I'd always carry an extra pack of cigarettes on me just in case something ever happened. But no, no. I don't know who it was. I don't know if it was my mother or my sister. Somebody gave me a Madonna medal, and I wore that the whole time I was there. You know, I did go to church when we were able to be off. I did go to church, and you know, and I still go to church. But I mean, I think more back then. Not that I was looking for anything, but it was just a thing. You know, it couldn't hurt.
What did you do for entertainment when you weren't on duty?
Can't tell you. No, we did, you know, and again, like I said, we would go into Japan, we would go into the city, you know, go into, you know, we'd do our typical GI thing, drinking, but we'd meet people, you know, we met people, same thing in the Philippines when we did that thing at Yubon, at Mactan. In Thailand, we met people that were, you know, younger people that were our age and stuff like that. We'd hang with them. You know, you got to see different cultures. We did do some sightseeing. You know, I went to a couple of Buddhist temples and stuff like that to see what they were like. 'Cause, you know, I wish I had done more. You know, I never really thought about it. But a lot of it was when we weren't flying. You know, of course, if we were flying an early and late mission, stuff like that. You know, those days there, you just you know, you stayed pretty much on base because you knew you had to fly the next day or whatever it was. But if we had a long break, like I said, when we were down in Thailand, I had those orders. We got to meet some guys that were there from the Australian Air Force. They had an F-86 contingent there to protect the base, and we got to meet them, and we got talking about Australia and stuff like that. And they, you know, if you ever get down there, you know, they gave us names and stuff like that. So me and a buddy of mine, one day we jumped on a flight, and it took us like 2 days to get there. But we went down to Sydney, and
Did you look them up?
we looked them up, and we found out that they are one partying bunch of guys. A lot more than we could ever party. But we spent a couple of days there, and then we headed back and stuff like that. But it was, you know, it was quite an experience, you know. And I got to go to places I had never been to. You know, I got to see a lot of Southeast Asia, a lot of the countries there. I got to Hong Kong, went to Sydney, went to New Zealand, traveled a lot of Japan. When we did the drop zones in Japan, there was one called Mito, and that was way out in the boondocks. And I mean, we had to get there by truck. And when we would stay overnight and stuff like that, you would grass hutches with mat on the floor and a blanket that's about that thick on you, Mama-san would bring in and stuff like that. It was the real culture Japan. It was beautiful, absolutely gorgeous. You know, if you got outside from the cities, and even Tachikawa was a pretty good sized city. And once you got out into the country, out to these drop zones, where this drop zone was, you got to see the real rural Japan, which was absolutely gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. And the people were, the unfortunate thing is that, you know, the dialect, I could get around a little bit because I picked up enough of the language to get myself around. I could read a little bit of it at the time, and but I wish I had been a little bit more versed in being able to converse with people out there.
Did you see any USA shows?
And I got to see Bob Hope in Bangkok. That was in 1967. He was there. And the USO is one of the greatest things out there. If anybody has the opportunity to support them, please do.
What was your opinion of the officers?
99% of them were good. Again, being able to fly the crew system that we did, you get it's a different type of bond, I think, than when you're, you know, at an off military base where you're not flying and stuff like that. For the most part, I felt, you know, they were another guy. You know, they were just like me. You know, I put their pants on the same way I do every morning. You know, so and most of them didn't have, you know, some. Every once in a while, you could run into one that had the attitude. You know, but I mean, I'm sure you run into that with all kinds of people. You know, I ran into that with enlisted people that were ranked. You know, but for the most part, everybody was pretty good.
What's your opinion of your fellow servicemen?
I give them my life. And they do the same for me, probably.
Now, how big a crew would fly on a C-130?
Basically, back then, it was a 5-man crew. We had pilot, co-pilot, an engineer, a navigator, and a loadmaster. That was on a logistics crew.
It would just have one loadmaster?
Normally.
In charge of that whole load,
Yep.
then?
Yep. Unless it was a special mission, you might have 2, but for the most part, it was just 1. Today's crew is down to 3. Pilot, co-pilot, and a loadmaster. And that's because of GPS and everything else, and the aircraft are so much more refined today, and they still make the 130 today. They're still making the J model, they're making the Super J's right now, and they're quite an aircraft. But back then, you know, we needed a navigator. When I came back to the States, we flew a stage from McGuire over to Southeast Asia, over to Vietnam, and it would be a 5-man crew, and we would fly from McGuire Air Force Base, New Jersey, to Travis Air Force Base in California, to Hickam in Hawaii, to Wake Island, to Mactan in the Philippines, and then we would go in country and then back to Mactan, and then Mactan to Guam, take on fuel, Midway Island, Travis, McGuire. It'd take us 15 days.
And once you got back to the United States, you would do that?
Yeah, we did that probably once a month.
Wow.
Yeah, and each leg we flew on the 130 because, you know, it wasn't a jet aircraft, but each leg was almost 8 hours. So, and that was we were getting towards the tail end of our flying that we could fly because of fuel-wise, depending on what you had for winds and stuff like that. So that's why we would go from McGuire to Travis, and then we would get off that aircraft. They would service it, and the next crew that was coming out of crew rest would pick up that aircraft and take it to Hickam. We'd be in crew rest. When we came out of crew rest, we would pick up the next airplane coming through, and then we would take that to Travis, or into Hickam, and then the same thing to Wake Island and so on and so forth. So, you know, Wake Island, you know, it's a mile and a half by 2 miles. It's a small spot, but that's why you need a navigator too.
When did you come back to the United States?
67,
What month?
August 67,
So in August of 67, where did you go?
to McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey.
And that was where you were going to be stationed?
Yep.
And immediately you started doing these.
Well, I got the same thing. I had to get